Listen-only mode.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on roles, expectations, and responsibilities of the board. My name is Paula Ho, and I am the project coordinator for the MASSCAP Training Center. We are very pleased to be collaborating with CapLaw on today's webinar, and I am delighted to have two CapLaw staff with us conducting today's training. Before I introduce today's speakers, I would like to take a quick minute to go over some technical details. There are two audio options for today's webinar. When you signed into the webinar, you were automatically connected to the audio using your computer's speakers or headset. You may, however, choose to select Use Telephone after joining the webinar and call in using the phone number, access code, and audio pin shown on your GoToWebinar control panel. If you are having any technical problems, please try logging out and then logging back in, or you may email me at paulahoconsulting@gmail.com. There are two handouts available for today's webinar, which you can download from the Handouts pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. We will be taking questions today through the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. If at any point during the presentation you have a question for either of our presenters, please type your question into the questions pane, and I will pose the question to our presenters at an appropriate moment during the presentation. Finally, please be advised that we are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be made available on the MASSCAP website at a later date. And now, I would like to introduce our two speakers for today's webinar. Eleanor Evans is the Executive Director and General Counsel of CapLaw, as well as the General Counsel to ABCD, Action for Boston Community Development. She advises community action agencies nationwide on a broad range of legal, governance, and compliance matters, and writes publications and presents workshops throughout the country on those matters. Before holding these positions, Eleanor was CapLaw's Deputy Director and Senior Counsel, and prior to joining CapLaw, she practiced with the Boston law firm of Hill and Barlow. Our other speaker today is Veronica Zhang. Veronica is a staff attorney at CapLaw, where she advises community action agencies in strategic and operational matters and counsels them on a broad range of legal issues, including tax-exempt law, Head Start and other government grants, corporate governance, and compliance. Prior to joining CapLaw, Veronica was a corporate associate at the law firm Goodwin Procter. We are very pleased to have both Eleanor and Veronica with us today, and I will now turn our time over to them.
Great, thanks so much, Paula. Good afternoon, everyone. We're pleased to be presenting this webinar on board roles and responsibilities, especially in light of the new organizational standards. And so in today's webinar, we'll be covering a few things. The first will be the rules and governance guidance that apply to tripartite board governance. And here we'll focus specifically on CSBG standards that apply to board members, as well as other legal standards that govern the board's roles and responsibilities. We'll talk a little bit about fiduciary duties of directors and officers, and then we'll dive into the key responsibilities of the tripartite board. And finally, we'll end with a few resources, both those developed here at CapLaw as well as by our other national partners for further board training and development. To start, however, we thought it would be helpful for us as well as for others on this call to get a sense of who our audience is today. And so we're going to conduct a poll, and if you could select any that apply here, if you're a board member, executive director, a program director, staff liaison to the board, or other.
And also, if you're listening in a group of people in the same room, that's where you can select more than one if you're there with a board member and the ED and the staff liaison to the board. For example, you could check all of those.
So we'll just take a moment to do the poll. Great, so it looks like we've got a majority of our audience members being board members, but we have a few executive directors and other program directors and staff liaisons to the board as well. So great, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Diving in now to the rules and guidance that apply to tripartite board governance, Here in Massachusetts, tripartite boards are governed by a variety of sources of law. And the first is obviously the federal CSBG Act and regulations. If this is a statute that you as a board member haven't read in a while, we would recommend just taking a look at that statute again. We'll be covering some of the major requirements in the statute that apply to you as a board member, but it's not a very long statute, and we would recommend taking a look. Here in Massachusetts, Massachusetts has a CSBG statute, which is Chapter 23B, Section 24, as well as more extensive regulations. We understand that DHCD may be in the process of revising the CSBG regulations and have solicited input from individual community action agencies as well as the state association. So those may be updated in the near future.
And so just because we're going to be throwing around a lot of acronyms today, just so that everybody's on the same page, CSBG stands for the Federal Community Services Block Grant Act, and DHCD is the Mass Department of Housing and Community Development, which oversees the CSBG program here in Massachusetts.
If your agency has receives Head Start funding, you'll also be subject to the Head Start Act, which has requirements for the Head Start governing body. All Massachusetts community action agencies are nonprofit organizations, and so you'll be subject to the Massachusetts Charitable Corporation Act, and this really sets minimum standards of compliance and default rules governing the board's operations and board meetings. An agency, however, can modify those default rules in its articles of incorporation and bylaws, and so that's another source of guidance for your board. And then lastly, your agency's CSBG contract with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts may have additional terms and conditions. As we look into roles and responsibilities, since the Board of Directors is ultimately responsible for defining the agency's mission and programs and setting organization-wide policies, it's really helpful just to keep in mind the purposes and goals of the federal CSBG Act. And those are simply to reduce poverty, to revitalize low-income communities, and to empower low-income families and individuals to become self-sufficient. And this is from the federal CSBG Act. In addition to the federal and state statutes, OCS, which is the Federal Office of Community Services, that's the office within the Department of Health and Human Services that administers the CSBG funding. OCS has published information memorandum, or IMs, which provide additional guidance to agencies. IMs are not binding, and so they may be altered at any time, but nevertheless, they're intended to provide guidance, and they give a good indication of OCS's interpretation of the federal CSBG Act and regulations. There are two IMs that speak specifically to board responsibilities and which are useful to read as a board. The first is IM 82, which details the selection and composition requirements under the federal CSBG Act. So this is where you'll find information about the tripartite structure of the board. It also details some roles and responsibilities for board members. The second IM is IM 138, which was released just this past January. This is the IM that published the CSBG Organizational Standards, which were developed by a working group, including the partnership, the Community Action Partnership, and they're recommended as a set of performance standards. The purpose of the standards really is to strengthen organizational capacity and also to improve accountability within the network. The organizational standards are what we'll be focusing on throughout this presentation, and you'll see references to individual standards in the slides if you're following along.
And just to let folks know, the way the standards work is that they were issued in this IM by the federal office, OCS, that administers the CSBG program, and then states are adopting them. And so DHCD has adopted them at the moment through their contract, their CSBG contract with each community action agency, and they've said that they're going to be updating their state regulations to incorporate the standards. But they haven't done that yet.
Many of your agencies will likely be monitored on the standards in the coming months as the standards have gone into effect for federal fiscal year 2016, which began on October 1st of this year. So just a quick overview of the 58 organizational standards that apply to nonprofit entities. They're divided into 3 main thematic groups. As you can see here, maximum feasible participation, the second one being vision and direction, and the third, operations and accountability. Each of the thematic groups has then subgroups. Certain of these standards are directly tied to requirements that are found in the federal CSBG Act and regulations. These include standards on tripartite board structure and the democratic selection process. Other standards link up with guidance from the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, such as the standards on audits, and other standards simply reflect good management practices and the values of the Community Action Network. So for board members, your role as board members of community action agencies are to be fully engaged in these 4 aspects, and that's the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of the agency's programs. We've really portrayed these 4 kind of key responsibilities as a cycle, and the idea being that the agency develops a strategic plan for the role that the community action agency will play in addressing poverty. It implements and monitors that plan. It evaluates the results from that plan, and then the cycle starts over again. It uses the feedback that it collects from the evaluation process to inform the next strategic development process. And we'll be talking about kind of each of these components in the rest of this presentation. Before we do that, though, we just wanted to do a quick review on board fiduciary duties. So these are the set of legal requirements that apply not just to community action agencies, but to all nonprofit as well as for-profit boards of directors. These are the legal requirements that you're going to be subject to as a board member. Under state law, including Massachusetts law, every member of a community action agency is a fiduciary of the organization, and thus you owe these 3 duties: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. The duty of care is really an obligation to be diligent in evaluating and making decisions on behalf of the agency. The duty of care is evaluated from a reasonable person standard, and this means that you have to exercise the care that an ordinarily prudent person would exercise under similar circumstances. And the question that you're really asking here is, were the decisions that the board made a product of an orderly, deliberative process, or did the board just do what felt right at that time of the decision? Did the board have all of the information and resources available to it when it was making its decision? Did it ask questions? Did it engage in a full and open discussion? Or were decisions rushed and made hastily without full information? And the duty of care is important because, generally speaking, directors are not subject to liability if they exercise the duty of care. And so this is one of the best ways to shield yourselves and your organization from liability, is to ensure that you have full information when you're making decisions. The second duty is the duty of loyalty, and that's a duty to remain faithful to the community action agency. And here what it means is your personal interests as a board member are going to take a back seat to your interests in serving the agency. And this means that a board member must give undivided allegiance to the agency and its mission when making decisions affecting the agency. This often comes up in situations where there are conflicts of interest, where a board member has stands to gain personally from a decision that the community action agency is going to make. In that case, board members have to disclose and make clear that they have a conflict of interest, and then recuse themselves from situations where they might stand to gain personally.
And also, for those of you that have Head Start programs, the Head Start Act has some pretty stringent rules around conflicts of interest, and board members of Head Start organizations are not allowed to have financial conflicts of interest, period, with the organization. And you'll see here on the right of the slide a graphic from CAPLA's publication, Tools for Top-Notch CAAs, and so that's one of the resources that will be featured at the end of this webinar. But as you can see, if you go to page 9 of that toolkit, which is available for free on our website, there's more there on fiduciary duties, and that toolkit actually has a whole chapter on conflicts of interest.
The last duty is the duty of obedience, which essentially is remaining faithful to the agency's mission. This simply means that when you're making decisions, you need to comply with the mission statement that's set out in your articles of organization and bylaws. For example, a board may be approached by a funder that conditions the gift on using it for a specific program. So maybe the funder says that the funding should, can only be used for certain entertainment purposes. The board shouldn't approve a program that contradicts its exempt purposes, and in that case, exercising the duty of obedience would require the board to likely turn down that gift if it did in fact conflict with its mission.
So before we turn to the next section of and really delve into the key responsibilities, I thought we would just pause here and just see if anybody has any questions so far. Paula, have you gotten any questions?
No, I have not received any questions. So just a reminder to everyone that you could type in your question in the question pane.
And feel free to do that as we move along, and Paula will notify us that we have a question, and we'll be happy to answer it. Okay, so moving on to the board's key responsibilities. The 6 responsibilities listed here on the slide and that we'll be talking about throughout the presentation are ones that CAPLA has identified as 6 hallmarks of an effective tripartite board. And these are based on our review of the legal requirements as well as the organizational standards, and then also literature and examples of real-life, sustainable, high-performing nonprofit organizations. And throughout, we'll identify where these responsibilities tie in with the CSBG Organizational Standards. So the first one is determining agency mission, and as Veronica noted, the board and board members have a duty of obedience to ensure that the organization's mission is being carried out. And in order to fulfill that duty, it's important for board members to, number one, understand what the current agency mission is, and also to look at it and see, when did we look at our mission last, and is this still an appropriate mission for us, or do we need to tweak it in light of what we're doing now? So why does mission matter? Well, that's one reason why, is to help board members fulfill their duty of obedience, but also, as the slide indicates, providing a clarity of purpose for stakeholders. So unlike for-profit corporations whose purpose or mission is generally to maximize shareholder value, nonprofit organizations lack that sort of clarity of purpose. And so nonprofits also have multiple stakeholders who may have various and conflicting expectations. And so a mission statement is a tool that it can be used and should be used to provide clarity and unify stakeholders, whether those be board members, employees, or clients, or other community members around the purpose for which the organization exists. The mission statement also helps guide major decisions that a nonprofit board must make. So, as Veronica mentioned, there are times when there may be funding available to do certain projects, and the board may, or the staff may need to look at, how does that align with our current mission? Or maybe there's a decision about whether to buy a piece of real estate and that is being offered for sale in the area, and to look at, how does that fit with our mission. It's also important to be used to, resist mission creep, and that could be, as Veronica mentioned, sometimes funding opportunities come up that may be outside of one's current scope of mission, and it may be tempting to go after that money because you may say, well, in these days of tight funding, it's always better to have more than less, but taking on some funding may result in stretching staff thin or diverting resources from one activity of the organization to another. So having a mission statement and a clear idea of what the organization's mission is can help guide the board in decisions around these areas. So one of the handouts that was provided today is an article that appeared in our CAPLA update newsletter several years ago about crafting mission statements, and so we do encourage you to take a look at that article. But a good mission statement is one that is focused, and so you want to look at, when you're looking at your mission statement, is it so broad and encompasses so many activities that it's impossible to measure whether you're actually achieving any of those goals? Also looking at, is it a very long statement, a half a page, for example, versus a single sentence, and is anyone able to remember it? So sometimes when we're doing board trainings in person, we'll ask board members to, tell us if they can recite their organization's mission statement. And so it's nice to be able to do that so that when you're out in the community, it's easy to convey what the organization is doing and what its priorities are. Does the mission statement leverage the unique skills of your organization? What makes your CAA unique, or what values help to define your organization? And also you want it to be looking at, inspiring. Is it inspiring your stakeholders, your staff, your board members, others? And can board members readily call it to mind? If very few stakeholders know and understand the mission of the organization, it may be more difficult for them to be able to convey their passion or commitment to that mission. And it also ties in with the organizational standards. So Organizational Standard 4.1 requires that the governing board has reviewed the organization's mission statement within the past 5 years and assured, number one, that it addresses poverty, and number two, that the CAA's programs and its services are in alignment with that mission. And then connected with mission is the concept of conducting a community needs assessment and issued a report within the past 3 years, and that the board has accepted that community needs assessment. Okay, looking next at strategic planning. It's important for various reasons that the board engage in regular strategic planning, one of which is that it's now a requirement of the organizational standards, as we'll touch on in a slide or two. So strategic planning is at the very core of effective board governance, and we know that many of you have been actively involved in that process with your agencies. It's a way to help the organization be more productive by guiding the allocation of the organization's resources in order to achieve its goals. And in order for a strategic plan to be effective and useful, it must articulate specific goals and then describe the action steps and resources that are needed to accomplish them. So you can see here on this chart that there are various stages of strategic planning. So at the one end on the left is a 5-year or more frequent review of the organization's strategic plan, and the organizational standards require, as I mentioned before, a strategic plan, and that an agency-wide strategic plan have been approved and accepted by the governing board within the past 5 years. Then there's looking at on a 3-year basis the needs assessment and how that affects the organization's programs and activities, and that's required by DHCD. There's been some conversation here in Massachusetts about, whether the strategic plan could be combined with the organization's community action plan, and those conversations may not have been completed yet, but that is something to discuss with your board and, if necessary, get clarification on from DHCD or from MASSCAP. Then on an annual basis is looking at how are we doing in meeting the goals that we've set in our plan, and then reviewing programmatic goals and milestones at every board meeting. That doesn't necessarily mean reviewing every single program or activity at every board meeting, but at least having some review, a programmatic review at every board meeting, which is also one of the organizational standards. And so one resource that we find has been interesting and helpful is a book called Sustainability: Making Strategic Decisions for Financial Viability. And those of you who are really into strategic planning, we recommend that you take a look at that book. But even if you don't have time to read the book, there are a couple of short articles from a publication called Blue Avocado that sum up this approach to strategic planning very nicely, and if anyone is interested, we can share them with Paula and MASSCAP to distribute to folks on the phone or on the webinar. So what the folks who wrote that book did is that they came up with this idea that you need to link mission, impact, and finances, and that it's very important to look at both of them together, because if you don't have the financial wherewithal to further your mission, then you're going to be less impactful as you seek to fulfill your mission. So what the approach that they suggest in this book is taking all of the organization's activities, and those are programmatic activities as well as things like fundraising activities, and plotting them on a matrix. It sounds very sophisticated and fancy, but it doesn't have to be complicated. But plotting them on a matrix and looking at both their mission impact and their profitability. And so let's just give an example here. Say your organization has a program such as a food pantry, and you've noticed in the last couple of years that the funding for the food pantry has dropped off, but that it's still important to your mission because there's been an increased need for food pantry services. So I guess the question is to look at it and think, and so that might fall into the upper left box, high mission impact and low profitability. And so as you can see, the thought there is, one approach would be to keep it but contain its costs, or also to look at, might there be another organization in the community that program could be transferred to that could do a good job fulfilling that mission, but then free up resources that your organization has. So, for example, maybe you haven't been getting enough funding to cover the full cost of that program, and you've been having to pay some of those costs out of your organization's unrestricted funds, and maybe you would like to devote those to some other program or activity of your organization, but there may be, say, a faith-based organization in your community that already runs a food pantry that this program could be transferred to. Another example is, say, a fundraising event. For example, say your organization runs an annual golf tournament, and it's very popular because folks in your community just love to play golf, and so it's very profitable. But the thing is that maybe the folks who come to play at the tournament, they come and they make their donations and they have a great time, but then you never hear from them again, and so and they don't really tend to learn a whole lot about your organization at that event. Well, that might fall into the bottom right corner of this chart of low mission impact but high profitability. So again, you would want to keep the event because it's highly profitable and helps you raise valuable unrestricted funds, but you want to look at how can we take this event and create a higher mission impact with it. And so some things that you could do is, at the event, feature, have clients there in whose lives your organization has made a great difference, and have them talk to, maybe there's a luncheon at the event, and have the luncheon about the difference that the organization has made in their lives. Another thing to do is to, be sure that you're capturing the contact information for all of the participants in the event and following up with them regularly afterwards with, newsletters and other ways for them to become involved with your organization, such as maybe in the winter you have a fundraising drive for, to provide coats and toys and things like that, and or other types of opportunities to engage with the organization throughout the year. So the idea is that you can connect with those donors and see if you can leverage their participation in the initial event into further volunteer or financial contributions to the organization. So here we have on this slide the various strategic planning organizational standards that we've talked about previously. And then connected with that and the concept of tying mission to finances and to revenue is the board's role in developing revenue strategies. Now, there's not a specific... Oh, yeah.
Sorry, this is Paula. Can I interrupt for a minute? We
Sure.
have a question going back to mission statements, so I wanted to pose that before we continued.
Okay.
A question came in asking, if the mission listed on the bylaws is too long, can the organization shorten the mission statement so it can easily be recited by board members?
That's a great question. And let me just unpack it a little bit here. So first of all, bylaws often may include a mission statement, and let's just talk a little bit about bylaws, articles of organization, and mission statements. So the articles of organization that Veronica mentioned are the document that created your CAA as a corporation in Massachusetts. And so on your articles of organization, you're required to list the purposes of the organization, and that's what sets your outer limits as an organization. So you want to, first of all, look at, when you're looking at your mission statement, you want to pull out your articles, which are available on the Massachusetts Secretary of the Commonwealth's website, and if you don't have a copy in your office, you can just download them from the website. You should be able to, and if not, you can order a copy from them. So I first of all urge you to take a look at what do your articles of organization say in terms of your purposes. Some of you may find that your articles haven't been updated since the 60s, and so you may want to look at updating that language. And then there are the bylaws. So first of all, we recommend the bylaws have to follow the articles, and so so if you have, your bylaws cannot be broader than your articles, and so what we at CAPLA recommend is that your purposes language be stated in your articles, and that you not actually necessarily talk about the purposes language or mission in the bylaws, so that you don't run any danger of conflicting with the purposes statements in both documents. The mission statement, though, doesn't actually have to be exactly the language that's in your articles of the purposes language in the articles. You could have a shorter mission statement that's easier for folks to remember. And like I said, in your articles, you want it to be very broad. And CAP has a bylaws toolkit that we'll talk about later, but it provides some sample language for articles and bylaws that address some of these topics in more detail. But I think also that mission statement article may address some of this as well. So what we recommend is having a mission statement that isn't necessarily in your bylaws, and you can make it shorter than whatever is in your articles or your bylaws if you would like, to make it more memorable and more actionable. And the board would do that by, by coming up with the mission statement that they want to use and then adopting it by a board resolution. If you're going to change your articles, which you may decide if you look at our bylaws toolkit or contact CAPLA for some thoughts on that, you may decide you want to update your articles of organization, and sometimes that requires a higher vote than just a majority vote of the board. It depends what your articles and what your bylaws say, and it also requires that you file the amendment with the Massachusetts Secretary of the Commonwealth as well, and notify the IRS. Okay, so moving back to revenue strategies. So there's, like I said, there's not a specific organizational standard that the board develop revenue strategies, but it's part of the strategic planning process is looking at, here's our mission and here are our mission sort of programmatic goals based on our community needs assessment that we want to fulfill. Then a key part of that is looking at, well, where are we going to get the money to fulfill those goals and to implement those programs. And so for CAAs, often the answer is government funding sources, and because CAAs have been very successful throughout the years in obtaining government funding. But then, of course, there's also other funding sources, such as private foundations, as well as individual donors. And as I mentioned before, it's critical that CAAs have some sources of unrestricted funding because you can't pay for everything out of your government funds. There are very strict rules on what those funds can and can't be used for, so it's always good to have some other funding that you can use to do some of the things that you want to do, such as, for example, lobbying or fundraising, for that matter, that you can't use your federal funds to pay for. Some organizations also engage in earned income ventures, which generate additional income, which may, depending on how the ventures are structured, may or may not be unrestricted funding. And so for example, some organizations have leveraged their weatherization assistance program for low-income people. They've realized, oh, we're very strong in performing weatherization services, so we're going to go out and perform weatherization services for businesses or for over-income individuals, and we're going to charge fees for that. So there are various ways that you can structure that, and it's important if you're doing an income venture to structure it properly, and CAPLA has experience in advising on that, so that's an area that you have questions about, we're here to help with that. But anyway, that's one area where some CAAs have generated some additional sources of funds. And then it's just also important for the board, through its monitoring of activities, which Veronica will talk about in a moment, to look at financial sustainability of overall and of particular programs. So if a program is losing money year after year, it may be time to look at, is this something that we want to keep doing? And if so, okay, we'll put some unrestricted funding to support it, but we want to make sure that that's a key priority of our organization before we decide to do that. Then also, board members can also help generate revenue for the organization by building and cultivating relationships in the community, whether those be with donors or other partner organizations, governmental or nonprofits, or businesses, employers, chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, that type of thing. And board members can be, learn how to be advocates for the organization, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, we have a poll for you. So we'd be curious to know, of those on the call, which types of fundraising strategies your organization currently engages in, whether those be one-on-one targeted asks from individual donors, whether those be special fundraising events such as golf tournaments or galas or other fundraising events. Do you do direct mail or online campaigns for raising funds? Do you seek out foundation grants, or do you have earned income ventures? And feel free to check all that apply here. And while we're waiting, I'll just say a few more words about mission statements. So just to kind of sum up, we recommend that, again, that the mission statement be a separate document, separate from the articles of organization and separate from the bylaws, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, so that the articles provide the broadest framework for what your organization can do, but so that you can be much more targeted in your mission statement, and also so that the bylaws don't you don't have to worry about the bylaws conflicting with the articles, and it's easier to change a mission statement by a board resolution than it is sometimes to change articles or bylaws, which may require a higher vote of the board. Okay, well, so we are glad to see that 100% of the organizations on the call conduct special fundraising events to raise some unrestricted funds. And then that's really great that we're seeing about 79% of those of you on the call engage in one-on-one targeted asks of presumably private donors, but maybe businesses as well. And I think if you talk to fundraising consultants, of which unfortunately neither Veronica nor I are one, but what I have heard about fundraising is that what's really important is creating relationships with donors and potential donors and having those one-on-one targeted conversations and asks, and that one might not, at following up on the golf tournament, you may not seek money from, or seek to fundraise from an individual who comes to the tournament right away, or hit them up for money again, but just to have an ongoing relationship with some of the folks who come, and to see what their interest is in the organization, and cultivate that relationship over the years, and that can lead to some very generous contributions in the long run. So we see that a majority of you also engage in either online or direct mail fundraising, or both, and also 85% seek foundation grants, and a much smaller number engage in earned income ventures, and we're glad to see that some of you are doing that. It's not necessarily the route for everybody, but some folks have found it to be a good way to raise funds. But one thing with earned income ventures to keep in mind is that, like other businesses that are startup businesses, that it does take time, it takes resources, that you may be taking those away from some of your other activities, and some new businesses often do not succeed. So it's important to go into that with your eyes open, looking at what sort of resources you have on staff to do that, what kind of business plan you have, and where you're going to get the money to do an earned income venture. And then the last thing I'm going to be talking about is the board's role in engaging the community, which also ties in with organizational standards, and as we'll see in a moment. But looking at, as a board, are we fully engaging and empowering the low-income community? So the Federal CSBG Act talks about maximum participation of low-income people in planning and making decisions about the programs and activities of the organization, and about how to improve their communities. And this has been a hallmark of the Community Action Program since the 1960s, when the Economic Opportunity Act, which got many community action agencies off the ground, included the idea of maximum feasible participation of low-income people. And one way to fully engage and empower the low-income community is by the low-income or community sector on the tripartite board. So ensuring that you have either actual low-income people, currently low-income people on the board, or folks who have previously or recently been low-income. While it's not a requirement to have currently low-income people, in other words, you don't have to be low-income to fill the low-income sector seat on the board. It's a good idea to do that to get the voice of low-income people expressed on the board. But then there are other ways to engage the low-income community as well, whether it be through your needs assessment process, or having public meetings about your planning process, or just about issues affecting the low-income community in your area, or helping clients of your programs develop leadership skills through serving on the Head Start Policy Council, or through serving in an advisory capacity to your board, or in other areas. Just looking at different ways that you can engage the low-income community. Also thinking about, are we as a board and as individual board members effective advocates for the organization and its mission? So we talked about understanding the mission, and then, but also thinking about how are we going out in the community and advocating for the organization? Are we as board members going out and going to meetings of groups in the community? So, for example, if you're a member of the Rotary Club, is there ever an opportunity where you could speak to the Rotary Club about the work of the Community Action Agency in the community? Or if you're a member of the Chamber of Commerce or a faith-based organization, are there ways to spread the word about what the CAP is doing with members of those groups? And often that is an area where boards and board members may like to have some additional training on, if we go out and speak in the community, what should we say? And this could be a topic for training, for example, practicing doing a little elevator speech about the Community Action Agency and what it's doing and what its needs might be, for example. Also, do we collect and provide input on community needs? And, presumably that's done as part of the needs assessment, and we'll talk about the organizational standard around that in a moment. And also, what is our case for support in the community when we go out and talk to people, and could that case for support be more effective in the current funding environment? But really kind of strategizing around how are we getting out there in the community to let folks know about what we're doing, let folks know about what we can do for them as clients, and what we can do for them as employers, for example. Are there ways that we can create strategic partnerships and collaborations, not just with other nonprofits, but maybe there are things that we can do to provide value for landlords who maybe have a lot of low-income people in their housing, and maybe we can provide some case management on site and have them pay us to do that, for example. And here are some of the standards around engaging the community from the organizational standards.
Before we move on to the fifth responsibility, I just wanted to pause to see if there were any questions.
Hi, this is Paula. I have not received any more questions since the last one. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box.
Great, thanks, Paula. So the fifth responsibility is around monitoring agency performance, and this is an area that we often get questions about after something has gone wrong, and so it's really important for boards to be monitoring agency performance on a regular basis. I think oftentimes allegations of financial mismanagement or impropriety result from boards not regularly overseeing the financial circumstances of the agency. And so here, the board should be involved in setting the annual and long-term financial goals and plans of the agency. This is done primarily through an agency-wide budget, and there's an organizational standard that's on the screen that speaks to that. The governing body must annually approve an organization-wide budget, which is usually prepared by the organization's staff, the CFO and fiscal department. But for the board to not just take that budget and sort of rubber stamp it, but to look into the numbers and to be asking questions to really understand whether that budget reflects the full costs of the agency's programs and activities. One of the difficulties for an agency that relies primarily on government funding, especially if you're not on an if you're not receiving funding on an advance basis but are on a cost reimbursement basis, is planning for cash needs and ensuring that your cash flow from month to month remains steady. And that also may involve on a more long-term basis, so beyond the annual budget, is establishing operating reserves and making sure that the board is aware and has policies in place on their use. We know that MASSCAP recently conducted a webinar on financial oversight, so we don't want to duplicate that webinar. But one area that we wanted to focus on here is that of performance dashboards. So one aspect of monitoring financial performance is I think a dilemma that boards often face is they are not involved in the day-to-day operations of an agency and thus don't always know kind of on a real-time basis what the financial needs and financial management of the organization are. There are many board members whose expertise may not be in the financial field, and so some board members may feel like they receive financial reports but don't necessarily know what to look for. I think there's one resource that Eleanor mentioned earlier, which is the Tools for Top-Notch CAAs. We'll highlight again at the end of this presentation. That resource has an entire section that's devoted to explaining kind of pretty basic level what financial statements you typically will receive and what those mean and what to look out for. But one other area that is helpful for boards, and we've seen many agencies use successfully, is a performance dashboard, and that really highlights certain data and keys it to a target that helps boards understand whether they need to take action based on a key indicator. We'll talk a little bit more about financial dashboards. I think in conjunction with that, board should be reviewing financial statements at every board meeting. And included in the financial statements, we really recommend that boards use forecasting. So financial statements are often present and even backward looking. You're looking at where the agency is year to date. But again, because cash flow is an important aspect of a community action agency's operations, the board really should be looking not just at past and current positions, but also looking at projections on where the agency will be at the end of a budget cycle. And the goal of monitoring financial performance is for the board to be able to have a frank conversation about whether it's appropriate to expand or perhaps you need to shrink programs and services in order to stay on budget, to determine whether or not additional revenue is needed, and if so, some of the revenue strategies that Eleanor talked about earlier might come into play. And then also the board is ultimately wanting to know whether the management of a community action agency, the fiscal department, the executive director, how is the agency using its funds? Is it effective in meeting the organization's mission? Or is the organization properly stewarding those funds? So what financial reports should the board review? Here we've sort of separated out for program managers, executive directors, and boards, the different types of reports that each should be looking at. And for the board of directors, which is the column on the right, you'll see it's not just the basic financial information, financial statements such as balance sheets, income statements, year-end projections, and cash flow projections, but also a performance dashboard. So we'll just turn now to talking a little bit about performance dashboards. Performance dashboards are intended to be a quick way for someone who hasn't looked at the financial statements to get a sense of how the organization is doing at this moment. If you think about the dashboard of a car, the driver is able to see a number of indicators in the dashboard, such as how fast the car is going, how much gas is left in the tank, whether the engine needs servicing, whether the air conditioning is on. The same way, a performance dashboard is intended to give you a snapshot of the agency at any given time. Financial dashboards, it's helpful if they're visually appealing, if they tell boards exactly what they need to know and point them to decisions that they may need to make. They usually will show performance against a defined target performance indicator, and we'll take a look at some of these in the examples of performance dashboards. The purpose of the dashboard really is to highlight red flags, is to say this is an area of concern that the board really should be thinking about, and helps the board to manage the risks that are involved in running the agency. And lastly, a performance dashboard isn't meant to just be information for the board. It's meant to facilitate discussion and to support decision making. Since we don't have time on this webinar to go into depth about how to construct a dashboard, there's a webinar that we've just provided a link to here on our website. We had a consultant who did a webinar on constructing a CAA dashboard, which you might take a look at after this webinar.
And just also to clarify, there's no specific requirement that you use dashboards for your organization, but as Veronica said, it can be a very effective way of sharing and depicting key data that can be used for decision making, and in our experience, this is becoming more common among nonprofits and CAAs as a way to convey information, although it's not necessarily a replacement for providing the actual financial statements that people can look at as well.
That's right. So dashboards are really something that complements reports. It tries to summarize the information that is already in the financial reports into something that's visually appealing and easy for board members to understand. So here are some examples of performance dashboards. You'll see that some of these have to do with financial performance. Those are the top row, the two charts that show unrestricted net assets as well as year-to-date operating results, showing year-to-year. But performance dashboards can also be used for non-financial performance indicators, and at the bottom you'll see dashboards that show enrollment on a year-to-year basis by grade levels, and then looking at costs per outcome. And I think a useful way of using a dashboard is shown on this screen, where the organization has essentially defined what target they would like to achieve for each type of performance indicator. So in the second column, for instance, the first row is the number of months of unrestricted net assets. If you look at the last column, which is the target, the board has said, you know, if we're exceeding 3 months, so we have more than 3 months of unrestricted net assets, the organization is doing great. It's meeting its target. Perhaps even exceeding the target. 1 to 3 months, the agency is within the range, and if we are dropping below 1 month of unrestricted net assets, that's a place where the agency might need to look into reasons why our cash flow is dropping that low. And so if you prepare a dashboard in this way, where the red, green, and yellow indicate different aspects of whether or not the agency is hitting a target, this again is, in one screen, enables board members, rather than having to dig through a number of financial statements to understand where the agency is and what decisions it might need to make, this helps board members see it very clearly on one screen. So we just wanted to open another polling question, and that's to ask whether your board currently uses performance dashboards to monitor agency performance.
And by performance dashboards, we mean either financial or programmatic or both. Is that right?
That's right. So we'll just take a moment to do that. So it looks like the poll results are in, and it looks like a majority of agencies on the webinar use a performance dashboard, which is great. And for those of you who don't, it may be something that your agency would consider doing. This is something that usually the board chair might work in conjunction with the fiscal director or the executive director to prepare. And again, there is a webinar that you might look into if you have more questions about using a performance dashboard.
And also for those of you who are using them, this might be an area where, if you're willing, through MASSCAP, to perhaps share your learning on this with some of your colleagues who may not be using dashboards. There may be some training opportunities there.
This slide just really shows some of the potential performance indicators. So as we said earlier, many dashboards use financial performance indicators, but this slide really goes to show that you can use dashboards for more than that. The idea behind dashboards and strategic planning in general is to be monitoring and evaluating outcomes and have that drive your decision making. So it's not just financial health, but things like human resources, outreach and advocacy, and for each of these, you have to set a performance indicator and then try to measure. Because financial health is easy using numbers and your financial statements, some of these other areas may be a little bit more difficult to set what your indicators or what your outcomes are going to be. But I think we hope just by putting this slide up that you'll see that the board can really be looking at all aspects of the organization.
But just to say that, you know, no requirement, again, to look at all of these aspects, but these are just things that if the board chose to prioritize some of them, they could develop dashboards to do that.
These are the 3 organizational standards that sort of speak to collecting data and analyzing that data. And as you can see, the organizational standards are broad. It doesn't say which areas the board must collect data for. There's customer satisfaction data has to be reported to the governing board, and the governing board should receive an annual update on specific strategies included in the community action plan. But again, this gives a lot of leeway to the board and to the agency for determining which areas they want to monitor. This slide is really just a review of some of the things that we've talked about, and so I won't dwell on it, but essentially that the board should be involved in reviewing financial statements. That includes selecting and monitoring your auditor, and this organizational standard reiterates the fact that the board has to receive financial reports at each regular meeting. The last responsibility that we'll cover on this webinar is compliance. And ensuring compliance is really at the heart of exercising oversight. And so what we've done is just put together a list, and we'll go through them, of 6 common mistakes regarding compliance that we see nonprofit boards often make, and some of the consequences for these mistakes. The first is failing to understand fiduciary duties. And as we talked about earlier in this presentation, nonprofit board members owe fiduciary duties of care, duties of loyalty, and duties of obedience. And failure to understand and fulfill those duties can subject individual board members to personal liability. And so just talking about some of the oversight and the various players that are involved. In Massachusetts, all nonprofit organizations, so all community action agencies, will be subject to the Attorney General Office's oversight. The AG has broad jurisdiction over the use of your charitable funds, any sort of corporate impropriety or fraud or allegations of fraud, as well as your fundraising activities. And the AG will often use its enforcement powers if it suspects that a nonprofit organization is misusing charitable funds or has conducted its fundraising activities in a way that hints of fraud or other malfeasance. And then one thing just to keep in mind as board members is that the AG and sometimes court approval are required for certain actions that a board or that an agency takes, and that includes changing charitable purposes. So Eleanor had mentioned earlier that you might consider, if you haven't looked at your agency's Articles of Incorporation mission in a while, that the board might decide to change its mission. If so, the AG's office will require approval for that, and that's something that you might have to think about if your board is looking to revise its mission statement in Articles of Incorporation charitable purpose, not the standalone mission statement that Eleanor had mentioned.
Right, and again, if you're working on this issue and you have questions, feel free to contact CAPLA and we can help walk you through some of these rules. And also just to say, I know Veronica did mention those words that strike fear into every board member's heart, personal liability, and I just want to assure board members on the call that it's very rare that board members are found personally liable, but it's important to be sure to exercise your fiduciary duties in such a way as to minimize any chances of that. Also, again, a topic for another training is there are various volunteer protection laws, both at the federal level and the state level, that specifically protect board members in many instances from liability, but it is important to exercise your fiduciary duties.
AG and sometimes court approval are required for some of these other actions that we've listed, including sales of a substantial portion of the organization's assets and dissolution of the organization. And then some of the IRS rules that will apply to a board member exercising oversight. There's the concept of intermediate sanctions, which is a type of penalty that the IRS can invoke. It's short of revoking 501c3 tax-exempt status. So if you remember, federal tax laws prohibit any of the nonprofit, the 501c3 nonprofit's earnings to benefit a private shareholder or individual. And the idea here is that the nonprofit organization is overseeing funds that are meant to be charitable in nature, and they are meant to benefit the public and not any individual or subset of private individuals. And where we see IRS intermediate sanctions applied most often is in the area of executive compensation. And again, that's an area that we can go into further, and you'll see or you may attend other webinars or trainings on this topic. But since boards under the organizational standards are responsible for setting the executive director's compensation on an annual basis, it's important to remember that the IRS, there are penalties that the IRS can assess on both board members as well as the executive that receives the compensation if that compensation is deemed to be excessive or unreasonable. And this is where board members can and should rely on making sure that the compensation is benchmarked against comparability studies. You're looking at how much executive directors in similar situations, similarly situated organizations make, that there is disinterested board and committee approval, the board discusses compensation, and that you document the votes in your minutes.
And in some cases, the comparability studies that Veronica's talking about, they don't necessarily have to be a full-blown, study performed by an expensive compensation firm, but the annual IRS reports that 501c organizations are required to file, the Forms 990, disclose the compensation of nonprofit executives, and so that can be a source of information about what similar organizations are doing. And those Forms 990 are available on a website called GuideStar, GUIDESTAR.org. Also, just one little note here too, another area for this around these intermediate sanctions rules is transactions of the organization with board members. So as I mentioned before, if you're a Head Start grantee, you may not participate in financial transactions with board members. But if you're not a Head Start grantee, there may be some limited circumstances where you could, but it's just very important to make sure that, for example, if a board member is selling the organization a building, that the organization is not paying any more than fair market value for that.
Another mistake that boards often make in terms of ensuring compliance is failing to provide effective oversight. And this often we see in boards that excessively defer to either an executive committee, a board chair, or the executive director. And this is understandable or tempting in many ways because board members, again, are not involved in the day-to-day operations of an organization and can sometimes feel that they don't have all of the information that an executive director or the staff would have about the agency. The primary way in which boards provide effective oversight is through reviewing financial statements and getting regular updates on governance policies. And so here we'll just talk about some of the policies that the agency's board should be overseeing. The first are related to payroll withholdings, and so this is an organizational standard that requires the agency to ensure that all required filings and payments related to payroll withholdings are completed on time.
And then if I might just jump in here too, when in the vein of personal liability, this is one area where board members and other organization managers, if you know that taxes, withholding taxes are not being withheld or paid over to the state or the federal government in a timely way, and you do not take steps to ensure that that happens, you can be held personally liable. So some organizations in the past have, their boards have required that documentation on a regular basis that those payments are being made. And we've seen organizations, community action agencies, get into trouble in the past for, there was a glitch in the transferring the withholdings and the money didn't go, and then they spent the money that they were supposed to use for that, and the organization ultimately had to close. So anyway, this is also for your protection as board members as well as for the organization.
And Eleanor had mentioned earlier the Form 990, which all 501c organizations have to complete, including all nonprofit community action agencies. The board should review the 990. Oftentimes we see that the 990 is prepared by the staff of the agency, but the board should review it to make sure it's accurate before it's filed. Other policies and filings that the board should oversee: findings from the prior year's annual audit, and if there are any findings that have come out of that audit, the board should make sure to address them and to document that properly in your minutes. As part of that audit process, the auditor should present the full audit to the board. The board should receive and formally accept the audit through a resolution and document that again in the minutes. And then the last standard on the screen, that the organization has solicited bids for its audit within the past 5 years. So if you find yourself having used the same auditor for multiple years and that it's been a while since you've put out your audit for bid, this organizational standard will now require you to at least put out your auditor for bid every 5 years.
And in Massachusetts, there's been already a requirement of periodic solicitation of bids for audit. So Massachusetts CAPS should be familiar with this. But also just to note that it's important to solicit bids in good faith, but the fact that you wind up with the same auditing firm that you used in the last several years is not going to get you in trouble. It's just important that you have an opportunity to go out for bid and look at what other audit firms have to offer and whether it makes sense to look at using another audit firm.
The organizational standards also require board members to sign a conflict of interest policy within the past 2 years. Our recommendation is that agencies distribute annual disclosure statements so that board members have an opportunity to disclose any conflicts of interest on a yearly basis. We have sample conflict of interest policies on our website, which we encourage you to take a look at. There are policies for agencies both with and without Head Start, since there are very specific conflict of interest provisions and prohibitions that apply to agencies that receive Head Start funding.
And also, this is another area where we recommend that the policy be not subsumed within your bylaws, but have it be a separate policy, because sometimes, especially due to various funding source rules, the policy may need to go into more detail than you're going to be able to go into in your bylaws.
The organizational standards also require a whistleblower policy, and again, we have sample policies that are on our website, although whistleblower policies can tend to be very driven by state law, and so we would recommend, if you have any questions about whistleblower policies, that you contact CAP Law here. And again, the whistleblower policy, it's one thing to have a policy, and it's another to ensure that it's being enforced. And so with the whistleblower policy, it's making sure that there is a procedure for employees to report potential fraud or impropriety, and that there's no retaliation against those employees. So here's just a summary of the organizational standards that speak to organizational policies. They include fiscal policies, written personnel policies, have to be reviewed by an attorney and approved by the board within the past 5 years. And then the last one, a procurement policy, which we haven't spoken in depth about, but as you know, the uniform guidance, which went into effect about a year ago, December of 2014, has a number of provisions, new provisions related to procurement policies, although, as many of you know, there's a 2-year grace period for organizations to adopt the new procurement provision. So if your agency has not decided to implement the uniform guidance procurement provisions at this point, you'll be under the old rules, and you have up to 2 years to adopt the new procurement provisions.
And the uniform guidance that Veronica is referring to is basically a new version of what board members may have heard of it in the past described as the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, circulars. And so recently that they underwent some pretty drastic changes, and as Veronica indicated, some of the major changes were in procurement. Organizations that wish to may take advantage of this grace period that she mentioned, but many organizations have gone ahead and adopted some of those new rules, and perhaps your organization has already updated your procurement policy. But if you have questions about that, again, CAPLA is here as a resource.
Another aspect of ensuring effective oversight is overseeing the executive director, and the organizational standards require boards to conduct a performance evaluation of the CEO or the executive director each calendar year, as well as approving the CEO or executive director's compensation. If you have any questions about going through this process, please feel free to contact us at CAPLA. We've received a number of questions from agencies that are conducting performance evaluations, and we have some resources that we can share here. And then lastly here is a written succession plan, so ensuring that there is a plan in place which covers procedures that should be implemented if the executive director has both an emergency and an unplanned or an expected leave of absence. And we have resources about succession plans as well. So please contact us if you need them.
Hi, this is Paula. Can I interrupt? We've
Yes.
received 2 questions. So the first one is there a sample procurement provision or uniform guidance?
So we don't have one yet. It's on our agenda for this year is to develop some tools around procurement under the uniform guidance. So like I said, we don't have one yet, but if you contact us, we may be able to help point you to some folks that have developed them, but we don't have one handy just this moment.
Thank you. And the second question is it allowable for a board member of a nonprofit to receive compensation for service as a board member?
So if your organization receives Head Start funds, the answer is no. And also most nonprofits and most CAAs, other than say private foundations, which community action agencies are not private foundations, most do not receive compensation for serving as board members, but sometimes we do get questions about organizations that have over the years had, provided a small stipend or such for their board members. And again, if you receive Head Start funding, then that's not allowable, but you can reimburse for actual board member expenses of, say, attending board meetings. So that could involve parking or T-passes or that sort of thing, or some organizations may provide, say, childcare or reimburse childcare, especially for their low-income sector board members. So those are just some examples. But if you would like to discuss the specifics of your organization's particular situation, feel free to contact us because this is a question that we help organizations with regularly.
And sorry, one more question came in. This question is, can you give us more information about where or how to get dashboard training?
Well, let's see. At the moment, the one resource we have is that webinar that we did, and off the top of our head, I don't have other resources available. But if perhaps Paula, you could send us that question so that we can do a little looking around, because I'm sure that there are resources out there for folks. And so if you send us that question, we can get back to you, and Paula, you could disseminate that information to folks on the webinar.
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
All right, so going back to the presentation talking about risk assessment. Again, MASSCAP had a training, an in-person training about the risk assessment process, but the tool that we would urge you to look at is the risk assessment that has been developed by the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. They have developed a comprehensive risk assessment process that's customized for community action agencies, and going through that process will satisfy the organization's requirement under this standard 4.6 to conduct an organization-wide comprehensive risk assessment. And I believe MASSCAP does have additional resources for the risk assessment process for the training that was led by Anita Litchblau just last month.
And also we're aware that at least one Massachusetts CAP has gone through that risk management center process, and I think from my understanding the way that they did that was they set aside 3 hours and got everybody from the organization who needed to be part of that process into the same room, and they just sat there and went through the tool themselves and were able to move through it, you know, fairly quickly within that time frame.
So the last few mistakes, one is micromanaging staff, and so this is the flip side of excessive deference. Some boards, and we've seen boards end up micromanaging staff in an effort to be more involved in day-to-day operations. And so we have this chart here that we hope will just help to break down, on a conceptual level at least, the responsibilities of the board and the executive director and the staff. And it's helpful to go back to this once in a while and to see how the board and the ED should function. And CAP Law has a new resource that, again, we'll highlight at the end of this presentation, a publication that's called Dynamic Duo. And in that publication, we talk more about how boards and executive directors can work together and to develop a good working relationship. But it's important that boards don't involve themselves so deeply in the organization's day-to-day operations that it impedes the ED or the staff's ability to perform their job functions. Boards really are supervising just one employee, and that's the executive director. So boards shouldn't be really reaching out directly to staff members without also involving the executive director in the process. And in the same way, the executive director should ensure that staff members aren't reaching out directly to individual board members and having side conversations, that to the extent possible that you try to funnel communications through the executive director on the staff side and through the board chair on the board side. Another mistake is operating with outdated or inconsistent governing documents. We've talked a little bit about reviewing articles of organization and bylaws to ensure that they're up to date, so we won't go into those in great detail, but the CSBG Organizational Standards requires that your organization's bylaws have been reviewed by an attorney within the past 5 years, and that each board member receives a copy of the bylaws within the past 2 years. For Massachusetts community action agencies, if you are looking for an attorney to review your organization's bylaws, please contact us here at CAP Law. We may have some resources for you or be able to help you in reviewing your bylaws. And then just the last two mistakes, not documenting actions appropriately and then failing to educate and motivate board members. We've talked a lot about making sure that your board minutes reflect the actions that are taken at board meetings. It's a fine line to walk with board minutes. You want to make sure that it's not just a straight transcript of board meetings, but also that it's not so sparse that it's hard to tell after the fact what the board covered at a meeting. Remember, for board members, you're subject to those 3 fiduciary duties. You really want someone who's looking at board minutes after the fact to be able to tell that the board exercised its duties in taking those actions. And so in addition to documenting votes, making sure that the board meetings reflect that board members held a discussion and asked questions about a particular issue. Also, Massachusetts community action agencies are subject to the Massachusetts open meetings laws if you go into executive session, and so making sure that you're following the proper procedures for convening an executive session, and then following the open meetings laws when conducting those.
And also, even when you're not going into executive session, you're required by the DHCD regs to make your meetings open to the public. And then if you're going into executive session, as Veronica said, you have to follow the requirements of the Mass Open Meetings Law. And then just also on documenting actions in the minutes, funding sources such as DHCD and Office of Head Start and others, when they're monitoring, often will look to your minutes to see if certain things that boards were required to do were done, and use minutes as evidence of whether your organization has done those things.
The last point about educating and motivating board members, the CSBG Organizational Standards require agencies to provide a structured orientation for board members within 6 months of being seated. We would urge you really to conduct an orientation sooner than that. As you can tell from this presentation, there are a lot of obligations and responsibilities of board members, and it's important for them to know what their role is quickly and get up to speed soon after they join the board. Board members must be provided with a training on duties and responsibilities within the past 2 years. And then lastly, that the organization meets in accordance with frequency and quorum requirements and fills board vacancies as soon as possible and as set out in your bylaws. The very end of our presentation, we just wanted to highlight a few of the resources that we've been alluding to in this presentation. The first is this Dynamic Duo publication that's available for free on our website. This is our latest publication that talks about how boards and executive directors can forge a successful partnership. And this tool is the Bylaws Toolkit, which Eleanor mentioned earlier. If you are working with an outside attorney to review your agency's bylaws, we would strongly recommend that you give them a copy of our Bylaws Toolkit. It has sample language to include in your bylaws, as well as some of the underlying rules and guidance that apply to community action agencies. One thing to also think about for your bylaws is that the DHCD regulations, the CSBG regulations in Massachusetts have some specific provisions that must be included in a community action agency's bylaws in Massachusetts. This is our top-notch Tools for Top-Notch CAAs publication, which is also available on our website for free. And as you can see, it covers a number of the sections that we talked about in this presentation, and is a helpful resource for your board. We have board self-assessment resources on our website that have been developed by the Community Action Partnership. The partnership has a number of resources for boards to understand the CSBG organizational standards. I think one we just wanted to highlight is this first one is a series of 10 videos on the standards. They're about 10 minutes apiece, and we would recommend that you might have, at the start of each board meeting, having one video that the board watches together. They cover the 9 thematic groups of the organizational standards. So as we just wrap up today, we had one last question for our audience, and that's thinking a little bit about the key responsibilities that we covered on this webinar, sort of for you, and if you're watching this presentation as a group, as an action item for yourself, which key responsibility do you want your board to prioritize? And so we've grouped the first 2 key responsibilities together in the first choice, and that's determining agency mission and engaging in regular strategic planning. The second one being develop revenue strategies. Do you want to work on engaging the community better, monitoring agency performance, or lastly, ensuring ongoing compliance? Which responsibility or responsibilities do you want your board to prioritize? And you can select all that apply here.
And your responses will be very helpful both to CAPLA in understanding where folks' priorities are, and also presumably to MASSCAP as well in thinking about future training opportunities. And also, we can't see which of you is responding on which one, so it's anonymous. So feel free to respond without feeling that anybody is watching you. Okay. So we see that 80% of you identified monitoring agency performance, which presumably goes to perhaps the dashboard issues that we were talking about, and some of those other issues, and is consistent with sort of funding source focus these days on looking at results and determining what impact the organization is having. But also high up there are ensuring ongoing compliance, engaging the community, and developing revenue strategies. And so, this is very helpful for CAPLA. Clearly, CAPLA has expertise on the compliance front, and in fact, we even have a publication that addresses creating a culture of high ethical standards and compliance, and that is on the publications page of our website. It's called the Exemplary Legal Practices Toolkit, I believe. And then perhaps less noted there, but still 50% is determining mission and engaging in regular strategic planning as well. So thank you for your response to that survey. And before we put in a pitch for our annual conference, just wanted to pause and ask Paula, are there any additional questions at this time?
There was just one more short question. I think it's referring back to the meetings. The question is, if meetings are open to the public, can they talk at the meeting?
There's no specific requirement that the public be offered the opportunity to speak at the meeting, but some organizations may choose, if they want, to have a time in each meeting where members of the public may talk. But unlike some states where the community action agencies are subject to the open meetings law for their entire meeting, and maybe in some other states that open meetings law may require the public to address. That's not the case. CAAs in Massachusetts, so the only requirement is the DHCD regs requirement that the meetings be made open to the public. And then, as we discussed before, if the organization is going to go, if the board's going to go into executive session, it needs to do it for the reasons and in the manner specified by the Mass Open Meetings Law.
And our pitch is that CAPLA conducts trainings throughout the year, but one of our major training opportunities is at our national conference, where we have 6 tracks of approximately 30 workshops on a variety of legal, financial, and other management issues that commonly arise at community action agencies. And so we would encourage you to consider joining us there. It's going to be June 22nd to 24th in sunny Fort Lauderdale.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor and Veronica, for your excellent presentation today. And that is all for today. Thank you to all of you out there for signing in and participating in our webinar. You will be receiving an email from me with a link to a short evaluation survey. We would really appreciate your feedback on today's webinar as we continue to develop more trainings. If you have any questions about today's webinar, about the MASSCAP Training Center in general, or about future trainings, please do email me at paulahoconsulting@gmail.com. So thank you again to Eleanor and Veronica, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.